So I was told that perhaps we didn't quite finish up Franciscans and Buddhist monks, and maybe there's a little bit more to say. I had mentioned, and there's a little recapping in here, but I had mentioned that the precepts that originally laid down by the Buddha, and they were a collection of rules that developed over 45 years. And it's possible some of the rules were added afterwards. And I became very conscious of rules because Americans, they just want to do what they want to do. You know, we came up with this incredible thing called the Constitution, which is constantly being assaulted by people now. You hear people say things like, well, it's a different time. Since it's a different time, we really need to rewrite the Constitution. And then they want to rewrite the Constitution by changing the way things are done without following format. There is a format for changing the Constitution. It's called amendments. And we have quite a few of them. And most of them worked out pretty good. There was one amendment we made to the Constitution which said that nobody got to drink any alcoholic beverages, and that didn't work out too good. All it did was usher in the age of organized crime. So after a while, somebody woke up and said, I guess we need to make another amendment to get rid of that one, because that one didn't work. You know, we used as a model the Magna Carta, which was used in England, which changed the relationship of the country of England or Great Britain to the monarchy and gave some constitutional rights to the people of England. Well, before America decided, I never can remember, I probably should write the number down so I can quote it a lot. You know, we're over 200 years old, but we're not that old. But 2,700 years ago, a fellow was born in the foothills of the Himalayas, and he started a religious movement which was by most considered the first religious order. Now, there were other things going on, but one of the distinctive things about a religious order is that you have a rule, which is a simple way of saying you have rules. And as time went by, we talked about this before here, and we talked about it when we were comparing the Franciscans to the Buddhist, that there are rules that had to be followed, and if you weren't following the rules, then perhaps you weren't really what you said you were. And the Buddhist monks had these rules. One of the rules was not to take life. Now, I have to explain to you, in the Vietnamese tradition, and perhaps in other traditions I don't know about, the lay people, and even the novices, are not supposed to know the rules. Okay, the big rules. They know the small rules, but they don't know the big rules. Well, in the small rules, which applies to everybody, don't take life. But it's such an important rule that when we cobble together the 250 or 248 or 227, and for the nuns, the 348, I believe it is, when all these rules were cobbled together, the first rule in there, after you became a layperson, was don't take life. So this must have been a really important thing, don't take life. And there are 4 what I call cardinal rules. That's the first of the cardinal rules. It's the first of the rules for a layperson not to take life. There are those who would say, well, you know, that's old-fashioned. And it brings into question the mere idea of following the teachings of the Buddha. Because if you're going to discard the rules that he made for lay people, for novices, and for monks, then I'm curious what you think you have left. Now, in this country, there's a great confusion. And I would like to go over these rules again. And if you want to, you can remember that the Franciscans, as far as I know, still follow the same rules. Now, it's interesting because I watched a YouTube. Tom Lung has me hooked on YouTubes. And I watched a YouTube, and this brother who got ordained, I got to watch him get ordained in this YouTube thing. He talks about the different suborders of Franciscan monks. And boy, there's a lot of them. There's the guys that wanted to return to the more true order. There's the guys that wanted the more difficult order. There's the guys that wanted the simplified order. But, you know, when all the dust settles, it looks like they're still doing basically the same thing. It's just a thing of emphasis. And this is important to realize that some people emphasize one thing more than they emphasize another thing. It doesn't mean that they're radically different or that they've discarded the rules. I have a student that lives in Washington, and he's been a student for quite a while, and he is trying an experiment. And in this experiment, he is ordaining people as Buddhist ministers. Now, as we've talked about this all-encompassing topic, we know that the Japanese in the Pure Land School, or the true Pure Land School, have Buddhist ministers. And the reason we know they're Buddhist ministers is that they are allowed to marry. There's no problem with that. They can be married. Matter of fact, almost all of them are. It's very much like the Lutheran Reformation within the Christian church of medieval times, where Luther ended up marrying a nun, and so did the founder of the Pure Land School. He married a nun, a Buddhist nun, thereby setting a unique example. And so, it could be a little confusing. I'm sure that there are a lot of countries that go, no, they're not monks, they're not priests, they're not Buddhist clergy, they're not really anything. Because look, they've broken one of the most important rules of sexuality. And of course they're entitled to their opinion, but the Japanese, as we know, tend to do things their own way. And so around the 12th century, a lot of things happened in Japan. One of the things that happened was both schools of the Zen, or Chan school, came to Japan from China, and Shinran established the Pure Land School in Japan in the 13th century. Okay, important stuff. The Pure Land School, the Jodo Shin, is the largest Buddhist school in Japan today. The second largest is the Soto Zen school, but I don't think it even starts to compare with the Jodo Shin. But still we have rules. Now this was an intellectual stretch. This is a monk who married a nun, who looked very hard at what the monks were doing in Japan and decided that in Japan this was the way to go. So I had this student in Washington, and he's tried this experiment. He's ordained people. There's a couple things I don't understand about what he's doing. He never, gave me a phone call and said, now what do you think I ought to do? He just kind of did it on his own. And then he announced it to me. Oh yes, I ordained someone before I left Arizona as a Buddhist minister. I said, really, what's a Buddhist minister do? Oh, you know. And then he decided to ordain someone in Washington as a Buddhist minister because she's a grandmother. And I said, so what does she do? Well, And then recently he decided to ordain 4 people as Buddhist ministers. Now you wouldn't know they were Buddhist ministers, you see, because one of the rules of most orders is that you have a distinctive dress. And the question becomes, why do you have a distinctive dress? See, I'm doing your two things. Why do you have a distinctive dress? Well, one, people would say, oh, so that people will admire you and you'll be a big shot. And that may apply to bishops in the Catholic Church, because boy, they got some fancy stuff they wear. But typically the rank and file monks in Buddhism and in Catholicism and in the Lutheran orders, Protestant orders that exist in Europe, the dress is very simple. And everybody wears the same dress. And so you don't stand out. If you look at the Japanese monks in the Chan order, in the Soto order, or the Rinzai order, the masters and the monks all wear the same dress on an everyday basis. They all wear black robes. It's only during big celebrations that they put on fancy clothes. But in everyday life, the only reason you would think one monk was the senior monk or one monk was the Zen master is because they're old. Because the title Roshi means old. And in Japan, you cannot have that title if you're not at least 50 years old. Forget about this idea of being enlightened. You have to be at least 50 years old. You may be enlightened at 35, but you're not mature in your enlightenment. It's only when you're at least 50 years old. In the Vietnamese tradition, you have to be 65. To be Watung, which is pretty much equivalent, you have to be 65 years old. It doesn't matter your attainment. There is a notion of maturity in there. But you know what kind of clothes we wear? We wear exactly the same clothes as a brand new, fully ordained monk on a daily basis. Because we wander around in a brown robe. The only difference is who bought the material. I have some robes that almost look black, and I have some robes that are actually a fairly light brown, but that has nothing to do with who I am. It just points out to people that I'm a clergy, a Buddhist clergy. I cut my hair because the Buddha cut his hair. A long time ago, he left his position as royalty and stepped outside of the caste system. The holy men today in India cut their hair off and they step outside of the caste system, because that, in the early days, that's how you knew what caste somebody belonged to, by how they wore their hair. Okay? And I've never been able to find a scripture that would explain why we continue to cut our hair, except that the Buddha did teach that the life is difficult only from the standpoint of it's hard to keep all the rules. That we occasionally stumble. And this doesn't make us bad, and there's no bad place for us to go when we die. This just means that we have to make some effort. Now, I always tell people to not take life as the easiest one in the whole world until you're infested with rats. We had a problem here this last winter. Oh God, it seems like it goes on forever. It cost hundreds of dollars to repair cars because rats got in and ate up the wiring. Well, what do we do? If you're infested with cockroaches and you live in a big city like New York or Los Angeles, so what do? If your house was built on an anthill, and every summer, the minute it got above 70 degrees, the ants started devouring everything in your kitchen. What do? Well, this is an issue of conscience. What do you do? And you have to take responsibility for what you do. And if you're infested with different critters that are going to cause illness or carry disease, then you might have to decide to get rid of them. But you still carry the responsibility for having to do that. And so if you did set out mouse traps or rat traps or whatever, then twice a month we come together and we recite the confession. And we acknowledge the fact that we're not perfect. And in acknowledging that, because the master, if he's 110 years old, is saying the confession right along with everybody else, that he may have tripped or stumbled along the path, and he recognizes his or her humanity, and so the confession is said. And we begin anew. Every 15 days, on the new and the full moon, we begin anew. We say we're going to do our very best not to take life. And this is a reasonable way of looking at things. Now, this group of ministers, it's very interesting. Many years ago, I took the Vinaya, the Pratimoksha, the rules that the monk lives by. And it's one set. You got to understand, we got a ton of rules. You know, there's a big misunderstanding because people say, oh, 250 rules, how in the world can you keep them? Well, most of them are not that difficult to keep. They really aren't. Okay, for young men, the prohibition on sexuality, yeah, that's pretty difficult to keep. That's the only one that I recognize as being really difficult to keep, because that's all young men can think about. And some young women have the same issue. That's all they can think about is young men. But the rest of the rules, you can grow into them. They're very simple. And for a group of people that were having a hard time following the rules, I wrote a simplified rules. I'm not the Buddha. I didn't try to change anything. All I did was make it more easy for people to understand. And maybe I broke a rule in doing that. There's a whole series of rules about robes. Okay? Whole series of rules about robes. How many you can have. If somebody gives you cloth to make a robe, which is a very common thing in Asia, that monks on special holidays will be given yardage for a robe to be made. They don't make the robe. Then another person with a great heart comes in and volunteers to make the robe for them. So there's always two people involved in this. But the rule says you can't go out and ask somebody for really, really, really nice cloth. You can't reject. If they bring you something that's really just such a poor grade of cloth that you wouldn't even use it to clean with, but they give you this cloth, a robe should be made of that cloth. Okay, it's that simple. And so, but you know, people are people. And they say, the Buddha said, you cannot ask anybody for silk. Okay, you cannot ask anybody for cloth made out of gold or silver. So then the guy goes, he goes, well, okay, I won't ask for a cloth that's made out of silk, but I can have silk embroidery in it, or I can have gold threads run through the flax. And so he ended up having to make all of these rules. I simplified the rule in the Mahayana tradition because monks don't own just 3 robes in the Mahayana tradition because monks do physical work. Theravada tradition they don't, but in Mahayana tradition they do. You know, if the floor is dirty, they clean the floor. They typically will garden. When the Vietnamese monks first came here in '75, one of the first things they did at their little temples, they were all houses, the living room was the temple, the backyard, they planted all the special herbs that they use in Vietnamese cooking. Because they couldn't buy them in the store, with the exception of cilantro, which was readily available, but otherwise, so they planted all these herbs. They got dirty. They cleaned the floors. They cleaned the temples. They might even have changed the oil on their car, I don't know. But they got dirty. So they couldn't get by with just a very limited number of robes. They had to have at least another robe. They had to have at least 2 brown robes so they could put one in the sink and wash it up, and the other one they could wear. This was just a practical consideration. So in there I wrote very simple things like, because there's a few possession monks are allowed to have, to not have more robes than you need. You're grown-ups. figure out how many robes you need. As a matter of fact, you don't have to figure out anything. Because if you're a good monk, people will give you these clothes as time goes by. I think I was a very bad monk for about 20 years because I only had one brown robe and one yellow robe, and nobody felt I needed any more. So they must have seen straight through my facade. Because one day, all of a sudden, I met a monk who could get me some robes. You only need one bowl. The Buddha didn't have 6 bowls. He didn't get up in the morning and say, I think I'll use that one today, and tomorrow I'll use this one. He had one bowl. That's all you need. The Buddha did write a rule that you had to have so many cracks and chips in the bowl before you could ask for another one. But the idea is not to hoard. We have a ground cloth. Every monk, fully ordained monk, gets a ground cloth to sit on. The Buddha sat on basically a ground cloth made of grass. You only need one. You can't sit on 2. It's like the guy that has 2 cars. Don't we always ask him, how do you drive 2 cars at the same time? Particularly if we only own 1 car and we're jealous. Don't we ask that? Yeah. So you get one ground cloth. Man, there are so many rules on cloths, robes, ground cloths, and bowls that this 250 starts shrinking down really quick. Sexuality. Don't mess around. That's basically what I said. Don't mess around. The rules are in there. You can't mess around with a boy. You can't mess around with a girl. You can't mess around with a doorknob. You can't mess around with an animal. You can't even mess around with a corpse. Now, my understanding of this, and there are people that honestly, truly believe that we're better than those people back then. That we have better self-control, we are more intelligent, we're more highly developed. You know what I'm saying? Because they lived 2,600 years ago, and we are highly developed. Do you believe that? No. Tell me the last period of time that you know of in your mind. Just think of this. The last time that we had no wars on earth. No wars taking place. I'm not just talking about America. I'm talking about Central Europe, where one faction is killing another faction. Okay? Islam's killing Christians. And Christians are killing Islam in the middle of Europe because of their religion. That's it. That's all there is. They're the same color. They have very similar customs. But you remember, Islam almost took total control of Europe one time. And so most countries in Europe have little pockets of Muslims. And they're still killing each other. It got so bad that some years ago America went over there and tried to keep them from killing each other. That's all we were doing. Just don't kill each other. Here, we'll put a fence up here. Don't kill each other. So we're much more highly developed than people were over 2,000 years ago, which is a bunch of baloney. Look at the way we've treated each other for the last 4 years. Half of the people hated our president. The other half of the people hated the people that hated our president. But we're a highly developed, highly cultured, highly civilized group of people that we can change the rules that were made 2,600 years ago. Don't kill anybody. How are we doing on that one? That's the #1 across the board for everybody. For lay people, for novices, and for fully ordained monks, don't kill anybody. Now there is a little caveat on that, that if you kill an animal, it's not as severe as if you kill a person. If you kill your parents, that's terrible. That's much worse than just simply killing a person. Neither are good. If you kill a Buddha, if you meet a Buddha, wow, that's considered, oh, wow. All the bad things that could happen to someone will happen because of that. So this group in Washington, they're going to be Buddhist ministers. And my student called me a couple of weeks ago and he said, I told him, he has 7 now. I believe he means he has 7 actively training with him. I believe. I'm confused because he had one that he ordained some years ago and he had one that he ordained a long time ago. So, but I think he has 7 active with him. And he told them, you need to memorize the Heart Sutra. Now, those of you watching this video, if you don't know what the Heart Sutra is, you need to find out. Because if you're taking your time to listen to me talk about Buddhism, you should know what the Heart Sutra is. It is the most universally chanted sutra in the Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist world. The Theravadins do not chant this sutra. Okay, but we're talking about the Buddhism of Japan, China, Korea, Mongolia, Tibet. We're talking about a lot of Buddhists, and everybody chants the Heart Sutra. And there is a collection of literature known as the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, which means the Great Wisdom Sutras. And the first one was about this thick. We have it in our library. Actually, we don't have 8,000 lines. We have 4,000 lines, calligraphy lines. But then we also have the Diamond Sutra, which is part of that. And then it's all condensed down into one page. And it's very hard for people to understand. They have to have a good Buddhist practice. Not only do they have to be meditators, they have to have a good Buddhist practice to start to understand what's in this thing, because it seems very self-contradictory. And they told my student that it was old-fashioned, and they didn't need to learn this sutra anymore because they didn't use it. Now, I'm confused, and I will share this. And I hope my student, if he were to listen to this talk, I don't know if he listens to any of my talks, will not be offended. But when you're brand new, you're not supposed to know anything. We've had quite a few people come to this center who became novices, and a smaller number that became fully ordained clergy. And when they become fully ordained clergy, they have an obligation to study with their teacher for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, it is assumed that if everything's equal, they will have been trained well enough that they can go off on their own. They could teach at a university, they could establish a temple, they could have a center for study, they could assist a senior monk. 5 years is a long time to train. And there's another 2 years involved. The minimum is 2 years. Here we have gone with the idea of 4 years as a novice. And in that 4 years, I have told all of my students, ever since I started taking students and teaching, that these 2 years, and now 4 years, but particularly the first 2 years, is your opportunity to know nothing. Now that's my nice way of saying you don't know anything. And the great master Lin Chi said, give me a farmer any day over a scholar and I will train him to become awakened. Because the first problem we have with scholars is they think they know everything. Think about it. They think they know everything. In my family we have 3 PhDs. I will say with an honest heart, they think they know everything because they have a PhD. So if you get a scholar that comes to you and says, I had one some years ago, came here, a friend of mine brought him up here, he said he wanted to be a monk. I told him what we did here, not that difficult, you know, get up in the morning, meditate, blah, 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 work around here. And I said, we have a very casual temple here. He says, not by my book, you don't. He said, this is a very traditional temple. You have rules to follow. The first rule is when your teacher tells you to do something, do it. The rule is not, your teacher is a genius, therefore he never makes a mistake, therefore you have to do what he says. The rule is, do what you're told. It's no more complicated. It's very simple. Assume that he's going to make mistakes. If you don't assume it, if you come study with me, I will remind you, right, Mom, that I make mistakes. You cannot live your life without making mistakes. It's part of the human experience. Unless you want to go live in a cave on the side of a hill and never talk to anybody, then you're still making a mistake. Because you're not developing the heart of compassion. You cannot live on a hill in a cave away from everybody and learn compassion. And the very foundation of Buddhism is compassion and wisdom. Those two things are the pillars that Buddhism is founded on. So how do we develop that if we don't have to follow what our teacher says? I go back to the late 60s and early 70s. If it feels good, go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter if it'll mess up your perception of reality, just go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter that down the road you might be sorry for what you did. Remember free sex? Take all the drugs you want to take? The federal government was going out of their mind trying to keep up with the drugs, designer drugs that were being made because there were no laws against them, yet people were jumping out of windows and stepping in front of cars because they were using all this stuff. It was an interesting time. Two things came out of that. A total disregard for authority. It's my opinion now. Total disregard for authority. And the use of the F word as if it was a semicolon, a comma, or a period. I know people that can use that word 3 times in a sentence and think they're intelligent. So profanity became freedom. We get to say whatever we want to say. We don't have to follow rules. I think don't kill people is a good rule. I think don't steal is a good rule. I think don't lie and talk against people and steal their reputation is a good rule. And I think the rules that people in Buddhism have been following for 2,700 years. And I don't think we get to argue about it. I can't imagine anybody that can come up with a reasonable argument that says it's okay to hurt somebody on purpose. So, this group of ministers, by the way, they're all older. They have degrees. One of them is a counselor / psychologist. And I'm guessing, but I don't know, I'm guessing he's the one that said, oh, that's old-fashioned. We don't do that anymore. I think of a Zen master that I knew in the Korean tradition who lost his faith. I really don't think that he was enlightened. I never really did think that he was enlightened, but I would never say that to anybody. They all thought he was enlightened. And on another talk, I'll tell you why I didn't think he was enlightened. But one of the things he did was he went back to school and he started studying Freudian analytical practice of people coming in and talking their problems out. And he made, I sat in the car as he told us, yes, well, you know, it's as good as Zen, it just takes a little bit longer. And a couple years later, he became a Sufi. And he stopped being a Zen master or a Buddhist. And all that told me was he never really saw his true self. His true self may have been a Sufi. Maybe it took all that time to get to the point that he wanted to dance in glorification of God. I don't know. But he certainly wasn't a Zen master in the Buddhist tradition because he didn't have Buddhism in his heart. And Buddhism in your heart is don't hurt other people. The beginning of compassion is to understand other people hurt. And it isn't just reaching out and poking them in the nose. It can be things you say and things you do, and you're so cavalier about it that you don't pay any attention to how it's affecting other people. So when my grandmother at the age of 96 said, how do I look? And I looked at her, and we all know what a prune looks like, right? It's a collection of wrinkles. And I looked at my grandmother that I loved dearly, and I said, you look great. Because through my eyes, she did. Through somebody else's eyes, they may go, well, this is an old woman. You know who I think the most beautiful people are, with the exception of Larry? Is old men and old women. And I felt this for a long time. They're the most interesting people to look at, and they're the most interesting people to talk to, because they're no longer fighting the rules.